My last event at the University of Lethbridge was a 3-hour lecture. And the dean said, well, just do what you normally did when you were at the university. Maybe you should have taken more food. The Roaring Twenties was an age of conflicts and clashes. Prohibition had set out to make America dry. Liquor and the law fought, and liquor won. Atheists and revivalists competed to see who could send most quickly the other to hell or some other place of extinction. Evolutionists and fundamentalists made a monkey and a mockery out of a Tennessee courtroom. Hollywood and heaven tangled as the most famous woman preacher, a Canadian, built a 5,300-seat church and theater 2 miles from Hollywood's door. Risque flappers did what good girls didn't do. They smoked, they drank, and they showed their knees. And young girl preachers called them out. One of these girls stood out as widely known as the child stars of Hollywood. This is her story, set against the backdrop of the 1920s, revealed through the incidents and accidents of doing history. Before we start, there's a couple of matters that need to be addressed. First, in order to set the mood for the talk of the 1920s, would all of you who have an alcoholic drink please take it to the washroom and pour it down the toilet? Completely non-responsive audience. But that's okay, because this lack of response sets a mood too, because most people did continue to drink and pretend it was something else, so you do the same. The second matter is that before we really get started, a speaker likes to know his audience. So let me ask a few questions. Who came here tonight because sex was in the title of the talk? Okay. You will be disappointed. How about drugs? Seems like the same set of hands. Jesus? Jesus and gin. Or who, having heard of the miraculous feeding of the 300 by the dean, came to see what other marvelous event might be performed here tonight by Dean Cooper? Another question is, why am I here? This I don't know. Most of my research deals with Christianity and Judaism in the Roman Empire. It's a little curious why I would be here talking about little girl preachers in the 1920s. It would be more appropriate for me to talk about things more related to my primary interest, like lions eating Christians and other culinary delights of the ancient world. So let me explain how that happened. We've all heard of the phrase publish or perish that seems to mark academia. Professors are always busy writing, except for the time they spend in the classroom or attending or, more likely, avoiding committees. But what about the books that academics produce in this publish or perish business? Academic books rarely become bestsellers, though there's always that hope every academic has that maybe their book will have that kind of success. But it's a faint hope, for books that make the bestseller list tend to have something more seductive in the title: sex, drugs. It worked for bringing out a crowd, or rock and roll or something like that. But as I've said, most of my research is about Christianity and Judaism in the Greco-Roman world, and there wasn't much drugs or rock and roll in that world. Sex there was. And we think both with Judaism and Christianity, but there's difficulties because Judaism had a lot of taboos about sex, and Christianity had so idealized celibacy that there's a good chance that you couldn't find much of that sex stuff there. So what was I to do in that field to produce something that could be titled in such a way to create a bestseller? Well, I thought maybe I could do a book on the babes of Bithynia. I knew I could find Bithynia on a map because that was a Roman province in the orbit of my studies. I also knew that I could find bishops, martyrs, exorcists, and heretics there, and maybe even a harlot. I wasn't sure about babes. I knew they were there, I just wasn't sure I could find them. And then, quite by accident, something fell into my lap that allowed me to produce a book with something seductive in the title. I was looking through a newspaper database online that had millions of pages of PDF newspapers going back to the mid-1700s. And I don't even know why I was looking at that. I didn't go back to the Roman period, but I noticed a column with a curious article in it, and it was about girl preachers. Oh, that's a little odd. The story was odd. So I just did a Google search. Girl preachers, thousands of hits. Boy preachers, girl evangelists, boy evangelists, all kinds of hits in this newspaper database. Interesting, but not enough to get a book out of. And then I noticed something curious. There were far more references to girl evangelists or girl preachers than boy evangelists in the period of the 1920s and into the 1930s. Now, for an academic, that's what he needs. The question of why is this the case? So I had a trail to follow. And out of that came a book. And a book that I could put something seductive in the title, which would make the book, I thought, at least the bestseller of the decade, if not of the century. So the title of the book was Out of the Mouths of Babes, Girl Evangelist in the Flapper Era. What I hadn't noticed was that this well-crafted title would work against me. Those who were caught by the word babes were put off by the word evangelist, and those who were attracted by the word evangelist put off by the word babes. So that is what happens to a book published that sells less than 300 copies. Or at least the royalties seem to indicate something like that. I had enough left over from that book to write another book, a biography of the girl that I'll talk a bit about tonight. The chance of either of them becoming a bestseller is about the same as a chance that in the audience tonight there's someone who will buy 100,000 copies of either of these books. I don't really care which. So what about these girl preachers? Are they important? And do they deserve a place in the chatter and Twitter 100 years later? Now, I'm supposed to be showing slides at the same time. I have big blue marks in the margin saying, show slides. This was what I should have shown and gotten a better response from you when I asked you to pour your alcoholic drinks down the toilet. And this is important. So we're back on track, kind of. Does history matter? I don't want to get into a debate about the importance of historical understanding, though I know which side I'd be on should that debate break out. But maybe I don't need to discuss the matter here, especially where people seek knowledge of their biological and genetic past through 23andMe and Ancestry.com. I won't ask for a show of hands. Simply change 23andMe to 23andWe, and we've started on that trail back into some sort of historical understanding. History is kind of the DNA of civilization. There's another reason history is important, and that is we all have some sort of historical mesh floating somewhere in our brain that catches a little piece of the past. Let me illustrate. I mentioned Prohibition. Just the mention of Prohibition, images came to your minds, right? You all had some image. If you didn't, have somebody beside you to wake you up, because the brain works that way. You hear something and images come into shape. So since that happens, it's better to have as correct and connected set of images as possible. Without a sense of the past, you're basically unable to function in the present. You're lost in the present. And so, looking into the past is something valuable to us as a society as a whole and to us as individuals. Now, there's a danger of not having enough knowledge of the past. A colleague of mine heard that Prohibition had become law. That's all the knowledge he had. So this frightened him. Liquor illegal. What was he to do? So he went out, spent all kinds of money in building a speakeasy, as you can see in the slide, in his basement. Had he known that Lethbridge was the only city in Alberta to vote against Prohibition when it became an Alberta issue, when Alberta went dry from 1916 to 1923, and that the American legislation was repealed in 1933. Had he known these details, the money he could have saved, rather than driving past all these places advertising themselves as pubs in his neighborhood that held no longer any attraction to him, since he didn't think they were able to sell booze. So knowing more than less is rarely a bad thing, even in an age where knowing nothing can take you to the top. I'm not sure you all have the same person in view. Of course, not everything that has happened is worthy of a story. My daily 4 a.m. cup of coffee won't make it into the historical record, except for the fact that by mentioning it here tonight, it has become part of that record, as inconsequential now as it was then. Most events don't make it into the historical record, though I suppose with Facebook, Twitter, selfies, and other such efforts to deprivatize life and to make epics out of the ordinary, every breath breathed gets public life and historical status. What kinds of incidents should get our attention? We have to be selective. Historians are constantly making those kind of decisions as they shift through the evidence, knowing that much of the evidence is there for them by accidental discovery, accidental preservation, and always knowing that the record available to them is incomplete. So historians are among the most humble scholars, the very most humble scholars. Anyway, I don't want to get caught up in the world south of here. So, many times it's quite by accident that particular incidents become part of the historical mesh. So it was in the case of the girl evangelist. I searched the records of the newspapers in about as long as it took to drink half a cup of my coffee. Thousands, hundreds of thousands of pages, millions of pages. Something I could not have done 31 years ago when I started my career here, where everything would have been on microfiche, and anybody that stayed more than an hour looking at through microfiche reader probably has spent much of their life in institutions to recover from that kind of work. So the mere technology has changed much of how we're going to look into the past. So, I hate these little things here. You'll notice that. Okay, here's the book with the cover. I had to pay $600 for rights to this photograph, which is considerable more than the royalties I made off the book. That's life. So that was the first book. This is the second book that came out of it. And it's the story of a girl named Aldine Utley, born in 1912 and died in 1995. Her story, very briefly. Born in Oklahoma, by the time she was 7, by the time she was 4, and after several moves as her parents thought their fortunes always on the edge of the frontier, she found herself, along with a new baby sister, living in a dugout on the Colorado Plain. The upper photo here is a typical dugout, much of it in the ground. Their own home is shown in the bottom, which they prided themselves in having a dugout that wasn't so deep into the ground. That's how they lived. In fact, this area was so bleak that the devil was selling places in hell 20-1 over what the government could give away land for free in that area. Bleak, how bleak? It's so bleak that even today, Google Maps and their Street View car has yet to go down that road. They had stories. It's an interesting family. They had all kinds of stories. Stories that would match Little House on the Prairie kind of stories. The only difference being that most of the Little House on the Prairie stories are fictional. Their stories were true. How about a story of your mom and dad going to a U.S. fort where the last Apache warriors were being detained, and fairly regularly dancing with Geronimo. That's a story that even on a cold Colorado winter day, I suppose, might warm the heart a bit. And this photo here is a photo actually taken by this girl's father, who had a photography studio at one time. He was involved in everything from looking for gold to any other thing that seemed to have a rainbow attached to it. This is an interesting photo. His shop was over top of that, and I want you to see that, it's not very clear, but there's a little bluish green line around a photograph there. You see this Republican headquarters? That photograph is Lincoln. Recall what somebody said just lately. Lincoln was a Republican. Who knew? At age 9, the family left Colorado for California. Who wouldn't in 1920? And they got into the raisin business as the Sun-Made Growers Cooperative was just establishing itself in the area. Perfect weather gave them a crop of biblical proportion. One bunch of grapes weighed 30 pounds. But bad weather destroyed their crops before they could get them harvested. Again, an event of biblical proportion as rain poured down as in the days of Noah. Then something else with a biblical texture happened. Eldine and her whole family came to Jesus when Jesus came to Fresno. In the revival meetings of the hottest preacher on the American stage, the Canadian Aimee Semple McPherson, Pentecostal preacher and Hollywood rival. McPherson was having a wild success throughout the West Coast. Though the success that she had when she came through Lethbridge a few months before the Fresno campaign, even though there was a surplus of sinners in Lethbridge at the time, she decided not to establish her headquarters here, but in Los Angeles. For any of you in the audience here tonight whose family history in Lethbridge goes back, say 100 years, a decision that one of your ancestors made in the revival meetings of Aimee Semple McPherson in Lethbridge accounts for where you're at tonight. Probably a bad decision for some of you. Anyway, so there is that Canadian connection, and Lethbridge actually is featured. You can read about it in the Lethbridge Herald, online, PDF. So Eldine, the 9-year-old convert to a revivalistic Pentecostal experience, by the age of 11 had become a preacher herself, and a preacher of some impressive success, drawing capacity crowds to the Coliseum in Oakland and to major venues in San Francisco. By the age of 12, her family had joined her in itinerant preaching up and down the west coast of the United States, and she became the sole support for her family. By the age of 12, she was publishing a monthly magazine of about 20 pages. Let me backtrack a bit. You remember the dugout? She left the dugout and was soon studying to be a little preacher in this impressive building just opened in the early 1920s. Quite a change. She became a star. At age 15, she drew a crowd of 14,000 to Madison Square Garden, the largest religious crowd that venue had seen. She was featured on the front pages of newspapers. She had articles in leading magazines about her. Time magazine covered her. She had become such a household name in secular and religious press that they often spoke of her by her name, Aldi Nutley, without even mentioning that she was a girl evangelist. Leading revivalist singers joined her group. At one time, she had a staff of 12. She was heard by millions in person and over the radio. The radio was just getting a start at this time. And by the time she was 18, she was writing a syndicated column for the Hearst newspaper chain. This is her crowd at Madison Square Garden. That yellow circle is not a glowing halo. That's just there to indicate where she's at on the stage. Oh, let me backtrack here. You don't want to see that yet. She was such an unusual orator, according to even her critics. One of them said, a loss to Hollywood. Clearly a star, clearly a competent person. But it takes more than that to succeed. So how is it that she and hundreds, if not thousands, of other little girls made it to the stage in the 1920s? There had to be other factors going on that would make this kind of acceptable. So let's talk just briefly about, I have to go back, okay. Talk briefly about children. Today we might be a little uncomfortable with placing children in what appears to be adult roles. Though there's nothing inherently wrong with children playing house if that's all they're doing. Children do it all the time, mimicking adult behavior. It can be funny, entertaining, cute, in the Little Rascal sort of way. But that kind of play is not performance. Child performers are of a different order. The prodigies, the gifted. There was a shift in attitudes toward children of such talent. Rather than treating them as freaks and misfits, they were adored and idealized. Even on the stage of prestigious venues such as Carnegie Hall, Aldine, at age 15, had a one-week revival in Carnegie Hall, and about 6 months later, Yehudi Menuhin was on the same stage for the debut performance with the New York Symphony Orchestra. In such a world of an interest in the young, the gifted young, little girl preachers had a place that seemed not so out of the ordinary. Various child labor laws were being refined to protect children by protecting their childhood and by restricting their hours of work. One might overlook such cases of Aldine and her Bible and Yehudi with his violin, but they couldn't overlook all cases of child labor. And Hollywood was involved heavily at this time in the child stars. If Hollywood had not been making news, front page news, with Hollywood stars who were 1 year old, 2 years old, up to 10, 11, then girl evangelists would have had a greater struggle being accepted. But child stars were accepted, and girl evangelists were part of that package. Now we get to this photo. Anybody know what this photo is about? This photo, if you criticized it in the 1930s, you might think about going to Mexico to avoid prosecution and a jail sentence. What happens is that in the age of the child stars, there came to be a hesitation about the use of children, especially the sexualization of children. And Graham Greene, a British journalist, called attention to this when a movie came out starring Shirley Temple, Wee Willie Winkie. He was taken to court by 20th Century Fox, and things did not go well. But there came to be now a public discussion of how child stars should be used and the dangers of the sexualization of children. Graham Greene called it what we would call kiddie porn. So that's a court case. Matters of the exploitation of children came to a head when the American Association for the Advancement of Atheism, AAAA, started to bring or pressure for law cases to be brought against child preachers because they were doing labor, they were working, and as such they should have fallen under the labor laws that were coming into place to protect children. Aldine herself was in court facing the labor laws, and no, she was not convicted. Well, she was convicted, but in a different way. But that was one of the tensions going on as a new style atheism, very public, arose. A bit more later on that. The sexual revolution. Just 100 years ago. What happened 100 years ago? Not that any of you remember. What happened in 1918? Pardon? Did they? The war, World War I, over, okay? The impact of World War I throughout society was substantial. I just want to talk briefly about the sexual revolution that came about from that, because that is relevant to how girl preachers came into the spotlight. Flappers. This is young girls who are doing everything they can to disturb old fogies in both conduct and dress. Here's a little poem. I can show my shoulders, I can show my knees. I'm a free-born American. I can show what I please. So, in this world where there was a revolutionary change in social mores, the girl evangelist appeared as the most proper foil against the flappers. They were the traditional girls. They were the girls that were an example of old style morality. Flappers weren't. Flappers were the new girl in town. And some people thought that was not a good thing. So newspapers began to use the flapper and the girl evangelist as kind of counters in this war of culture. Secular newspapers carried all kinds of stories of girl evangelist and the flapper and the difference between the two. And some newspapers were pretty public as to which side they thought was the better. Here's just a page from Salt Lake City, I guess, one of the Hearst newspapers. And this is, I mentioned that Aldine had a syndicated column in the Hearst newspaper chain when she turned 18. So here's one of her columns. It's about half a page. There's 3 different authors to this one page that they have. And she is featured. She has about half the page, and the other 2 authors share the rest. So she's the kind of golden girl for this page. One is about how to dress well. She's not writing about that. Somebody else is. Are you an executive type? Somebody else was writing that. She's writing about, as you can clearly see here, the life of the flapper and challenging that. The willingness of the press to give coverage to girl preachers became a factor in the increase in the number of girl preachers that came on stage, because little girls became aware that these girl preachers, some of them local, got front page coverage or maybe back page coverage of a few columns or a paragraph or two. Girl preachers became part of the recognized public possibilities. So if you were a little girl with a little bit of revivalism strain in you, that became a possibility. That you got your name in press. And so that in of itself, the newspaper attention produced even more little girl evangelists. Without that, I'm sure the phenomenon would not have lasted as long and been as significant. Now, 18 years old, she's writing a syndicated column. What does she do? She decides to change her direction. She had a very successful career as a little girl evangelist. She decides to change a bit. She turns from being Pentecostal to being Methodist, and actually moves to Chicago to study to become the youngest ever ordained Methodist preacher. Chicago. She left her headquarters in New York City. She had headquarters in the main area of New York City where religious publishers had established themselves. She was at the center of the business. She left her headquarters there, staffed, and moved to Chicago, where she would study and conduct her regular revivalist campaigns. I'm sorry, I'm a little off on these slides. Here's one newspaper, here's a front page coverage of her, and here's a spread, Girl Evangelist versus Girl Atheist in a duel for America's soul. And pretty clear which side the editor chose. Anyway, so Chicago in the early 1900s. You know the movie, and you know the men, and one girl. Chicago, Sin City, USA, second largest American city at the time. Aldine's career was roughly, she had a brief career, about 12, 13 years. There's an explanation for that to come. Her career spanned basically the period of Prohibition. Chicago, Prohibition. What do you have? You have the center of illegal booze, gangsters everywhere. She rents an apartment, upscale apartment, that is half a block away from where the St. Valentine's Day massacre occurred. 89 years ago yesterday. It had already become a tourist attraction. She was quite aware of this history of Chicago's underside, and she milked it in her sermons. She had other things she could milk too. Al Capone, get a sense of the age of some of these characters. Al Capone, 30 years old when he became public enemy #1 because of the St. Valentine's Day massacre. When in 1934, during Chicago's Second World Fair, Aldine becomes the featured revivalist of a major citywide campaign to catch as many people coming to the fair as possible. She spoke to possibly 600,000 people in person during the World's Fair. What's happening during this time that she could add to her sermons? Well, 31-year-old John Dillinger, a movie just came out featuring, what's his name? Oh, so you never watch movies. Johnny Depp, right? He was 31 when he was gunned down in the northern part of Chicago. That was a big year for bringing down some of the more notorious gangsters. 23-year-old Bonnie Parker and 25-year-old Clyde Barrow, Bonnie and Clyde fame, had been killed just 4 months before Dillinger. 30-year-old pretty boy Floyd was killed by federal agents 3 months to the day after Dillinger's death, and 36 days after that, 25-year-old Babyface Nelson was also killed by federal agents. None of these outlaws were that much older than Aldine, and by that year, she had turned 22 and had already been on the stage longer than any of these people that made their fame, so to speak, in Chicago. But 1934, Prohibition over, people are now serving up booze. Aldine continues to serve up Jesus. She's still a major revivalist. Religion. Let's talk a little bit about religion because I think it's clear that maybe she had something to do with that. What's going on with religion in the 1920s? Well, revolutionary shifts. There was a noticeable decline in Protestant, English-speaking America. A large number of immigrants came from Ireland and Italy, the shithole countries of that period. Another example of how a society elevates its own worth by demeaning the worth of others. In both cases, these immigrants brought their religion, Catholicism, and their drink, not English tea or Ovaltine, with them. And both their religion and their drink was viewed as a threat to Protestantism and the moralism of the temperance movement, a matter that became particularly worrisome when Protestant, German, Lutherans, which included many of the best-known brewery owners of the best-known breweries and the brewmasters, joined the Catholic side in fighting the temperance advance. Equally worrisome, none of them, the Irish, the Italian, or German Lutherans, spoke American, a language commonly known elsewhere as English. Well, most of the Irish spoke English too, but it would have taken a skilled linguist to recognize it as a form of the English language. Just an illustration, my 6-year-old grandson was traveling with his parents and brothers. He didn't like anything foreign. And they had been in Thailand, they had been in Poland, India, Belgium, France. And his mother knew that he was becoming quite tired of not being able to communicate, that everybody spoke some other kind of gibberish. So she told him, "We're going to Ireland now, and they speak English there." So they got to passport control. The Irish female officer spoke to them, and he turned to his mother and said, "I thought you said they spoke English here." There was other problems that American Protestantism faced. It was itself torn apart by an ugly divorce. Liberals and conservatives fought each other over the real meaning of the Bible and over who had legal rights to the assets of particular denominations. The two sides came to be referred to as the modernist and the fundamentalist. In any fight to the death, you find your allies wherever you can. And the fundamentalists, who normally would not have allowed a woman preacher anywhere near a platform, given the situation of the day, allowed such a horrible trend to actually establish itself for a few brief years, and included in that little girl preachers too. So that's another case of how society in the 1920s, early 30s actually was just ripe for the girl evangelist phenomenon to take hold and to grow somewhat. The third matter was the rise of very public atheism. 101 years ago today, well, not today, but 101 years ago this year, something happened. I guess you could say World War I continued, the Russian Revolution, and the rise of atheism, very public, and it became public in the very streets of New York City, and that became a major concern for not just Protestants, but for Catholics too. What was the atheism like at this time? It was public, very public. It fought in the courts. It even petitioned that the U.S. president change Thanksgiving Day to Blame Giving Day. So one day a year, God could be brought to trial and blamed for every disaster that happened in the year previous. They even changed, just in case there was an atheist who could sing, they thought it might be wise, since churches had a lot of songs and choirs and that, they thought maybe they should have their own limited quantity of music. They took the Christian hymn, Praise God from whom all blessings flow, changed the words to Blame God from whom all cyclones blow, complete with 4 or 5 full stanzas of blame. Somebody must have been sending such disasters. It might as well blame God for the one day they bring them to existence and trial. Atheist clubs were established in universities with inoffensive names like Truth Seekers and Liberal Club, and with some names with a bit more zip and zing, such as Sons of Satan, International League of the Militant Godless, the Hedonist Host of Hell-Bent Heathens, a Junior Atheist League, organized clubs in schools for youth from grade 1 to graduation. Little child atheist went about holding lectures on atheism and evolution. Here you have Queen Silver. She was the most noted one of these, philosopher and scientist, 12 years old. She was, like Aldine, young, talented, producing a magazine at age 12 about the same size, and with free admission, as you'd have in a revivalist meeting too. So it even made this whole atmosphere of the rise of a public atheism made it to the movie theaters. The last silent movie of Cecil B. DeMille was called The Godless Girl, and it featured one of these atheist clubs in a high school, and it added a cooperative monkey on whose head all the initiates placed their hands to take the pledge. A fourth matter in regard to religion in the 1930s, 1920s, was the dying out of revivalism. Now, revivalism had a long and somewhat noble history in the life of the United States, starting even before the independence and going through various great awakenings into the 20th century. But it was looking a little worn and maybe a little embarrassing by the 1920s. It was clearly not attracting the crowds that it once had, and people like Billy Sunday, major performer, was drawing fewer and fewer crowds, still big crowds, but declining numbers to his revival meetings. The stage, the revivalist stage, had to be made into something a bit more attractive. Some new ideas might be tried, and one of them was putting little girl preachers on the stage. One distinctive thing about revivalism was that they told it like it was. There was black and there was white, no shades of gray. There was God and there was the devil. There was heaven and there was hell. There was good and there was evil. And evil had so wrecked the world that God was about to wrap up the whole business. Any revivalist worth their salt could send arrows of despair deep into the hearts of the most hardened hearers. The sweating like a sinner in church kind of fear. Yes, I know, sweating like a sinner in church comes from a Disney movie, Princess and the Frog, and academics tend not to count that as a proper, respectable source. But see, I'm retired. I have 9 grandchildren, and I have found it increasingly more difficult to distinguish between peer-approved and simply profound. Anyway, the sweating like the sinner in church kind of revivalism was kind of dying out. Billy Sunday died in the 1930s, mid-1930s, buried, which is common. And only about 4 years after that, another guy started to stir revivalism, a fellow by the name of Billy Graham. A bit tamer kind of revivalism. And the latter part of the 20th century was marked, at least in terms of religion, by the rather significant status of Billy Graham on the public stage. But another thing happened to this dying revivalism. Somebody else took it over and added much more punch to it, and that was Pentecostalism. Pentecostalism became the revivalist. They had all kinds of people taking the stage. The Pentecostalism started in the early 1900s. It became part of its mission was to get out there and preach, and they did that with conviction and zest. They didn't need to be educated or trained, because in Pentecostalism, if they had an experience called glossolalia, speaking in tongues, that was what a Pentecostal would say had certified them, they were filled with the Spirit, according to Pentecostal view. And that meant, young or old, they were certified by God as able to conduct God's work. At least 3/4 of the girl evangelists that I've been able to identify from the period, whose denomination I could also identify, were Pentecostals. So Pentecostalism itself gave a new breath to revivalism, and in doing that gave also a stage to these little girls. I'm sure I need to use this somewhere along the line. Now, Pentecostalism, I've already mentioned fundamentalists were allowed to kind of let girls and women onto the platform, but fundamentalism and Pentecostalism presented very odd bedfellows. Protestantism, when did Protestantism start? Anybody know? Pardon? 1517. I was in Prague October, the end of October, 1517. I didn't want to go to Germany. I thought it would be crowded with Protestants celebrating Luther. 500 years ago, Protestantism started. Now, here's the difficulty. Protestantism didn't like the idea of miracles. Catholics had them. Protestants didn't, for the most part. And that was a little problematic because in the Bible, used by both Protestants and Catholics, there were a few of these stories of miracles. The dean's feeding of the 300, and Jesus showing himself much more competent with the 5,000. But stories of miracles in the Bible, filled with stories like that. So what were Protestants to do? Catholics had no problems because they accepted miracles in the modern period and in the ancient. So Protestantism came up with the idea that maybe they could allow miracles since they're in the Bible, but only for that period, largely of biblical times, Jesus and the apostles and such. After that, miracles did not happen. What then about Catholic claims to miracles? Well, they're fake, demonic, as any Protestant worth his salt would know. So by the time you get to the rise of Pentecostalism, you have pretty set view in Protestantism that miracles didn't happen in the modern period. However, Pentecostalism was part of this trend in the United States of some new religious movements wanting to match as closely as possible the conduct and belief of the first century church. The first century church clearly had miracle. It's in the Bible. So if you wanted a restoration of the apostolic church, then miracles would be allowed in. Mormons, initially, miracle was part of their belief system. Pentecostals, very much part of their belief system. So much so that it could change revivalism by adding a new dimension, whereas revivalism basically was about getting your soul saved, right? Coming to Jesus and having everything made right, forgiven, no longer hell-bound, but heaven. Kind of good news. Pentecostalism added something else. You're not only going to get your soul saved here, you're going to get your body fixed up too. So they brought in divine healing or faith healing into the whole religious market. So revivalism in the latter part of the 1900s, as Pentecostalism took it over, actually going back even to the 1920s, a Pentecostal revivalist would have a probably at least one night in a crusade where there was simply prayer for the sick, which could include exorcisms too, if you really wanted to add some punch to the performance. So what happens there is that revivalism, which seemed to be dying, gets a whole new life by adding a new dimension to it. And Pentecostalism, little girl preachers too, would be part of this revolution in revivalism and have their own, in their crusades, a night or two of faith healing, where people moved up to the front to have prayer. And that still is part of the religious experience of Pentecostalism. So that's Aldean's work. How am I? Am I running out of time? Pardon? Pretty close. Had you not had such a long introduction? What's the dean going to do to a retired prof? So let me just, was that the 3 hour or the 1 hour? So another part of the story is that Her story ended when she was in her mid-20s. She had a mental breakdown. And so actually there's two stories here. And so let me just briefly describe what I discovered. As I was finishing the manuscript, I discovered that her niece and nephew were still alive, living in Minneapolis. My wife and I made contact, told them we were nice people. They said, come and we'll share our family traditions with you and whatever we have. We drove down, and they had all kinds of things, photographs and letters. We could add a bit of color to the story. And then I found a file folder. And the niece and nephew didn't really know their aunt, other than a scary, withdrawn, mentally damaged woman. That's their memory of her. So I found this file folder, and in the file folder was about 100 typed poems. She had written a lot of poems, and many of them were included in her Revivalist magazine, but these poems weren't, because they weren't the type that could really have a place there. They talked about things other than God and salvation and that. Some of them talked about nature in its finery and its fury. Some of them talked about romance, blissful, blundering, and brutal. I couldn't have said that yesterday, because yesterday was Valentine's, and you have to say something else about that. She knew. Now, here are poems that she wrote without ever any intention of having them in public, read by others. Here you have what I consider the most authentic voice of a person describing their own struggle with being a star, a religious star in this case, and having everybody else under a different set of guidelines. Her conduct was always on display. She had to be happy, positive, and here are poems that aren't. She actually had a sense of her own coming mental breakdown. Some of her poems reflect this. And having decided to publish these poems, which would have meant the end of her career, having decided to do this, she was putting these together. And on the cover of the file folder, she had written for the title, "Kindly Remove My Halo." Okay. So we have here, if I can just take another hour, we have here a sense of this girl evangelist phenomenon and why in the 1920s and early 30s it could have the stage that it had. So I've tried to give you some sense of that. But there were things that weren't part of the 1920s and the 1930s. One of the things was this idea of burnout, the 24/7 kind of life. Another thing was mental illness, the stigma that came with mental illness and the seclusion that had to be placed over anybody that had come under depression of some kind or under mental collapse. And these things were a world unfamiliar. They didn't have the skill. Even today, with all our advances, there is a stigma to mental illness like no other illness. And this was a second story for this young girl. And I have nothing more to say. I had some wonderful poems, actually. The saddest poem, let's see how far I am behind. But I really don't care. She who belongs to two belongs to none, but she who belongs to none save God boo-hoos for fun. And I will leave it there. Now, I have some things I'd like to say that I haven't said, but I said I'd leave it there, and I don't want to be seen as somebody who misrepresents.